2 years ago, I made a video talking about the best tennis rackets for every type of player, but so many new rackets have come out since then that I figured now is a perfect time to finally update it. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So I obviously make a lot of top fives on this channel, talking about things like power, spin, control, some other stuff as well. But I think the topic that resonates most with people is how those rackets suit different styles. For example, saying something is the best control racket, well, that's all good and well, but what does that actually mean on court? Which type of player should use a control racket? That's what we're going to talk about today. We'll start with the best rackets for beginners and intermediates, and then we'll talk about advanced players and get much more specific about the different game styles. All court players, counterpunchers, grindy spin players, aggressive baseliners, serve and volleyers, and players who play with a one-handed backhand. We're gonna go over all of those today. Yes, it's going to be a long video, but I'm super excited for this one, and as usual, let me remind you that any of the rackets we talk about here today you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. And also please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So what I'm gonna do is talk about 3 or 4 different rackets per game style, and the other thing that I wanna remind you about is that 1, obviously I can only talk about rackets that we carry at the store, you know the drill by now, and 2, this is my personal opinion. Nothing that I say here is fact by any stretch of the imagination, and the other thing I think I'm gonna do is tell you which one I consider is the best for each category, but that's more for fun. No racket is really the best at anything. But anyways, this video is going to be really long, so let's get into it, and we're gonna start with the best rackets for beginners. Now, I actually made a how to pick a racket guide last week, and in that I talk about how beginners should go about picking a racket, so I highly recommend you check that out, but I'm still gonna give you a few suggestions here. The most important thing to look for in a racket when you're a beginner is something that helps you learn to play, something that doesn't add to your frustration, because tennis is a difficult sport. It can be very frustrating when you're learning. When we say that a racket is helping you out in tennis, what we usually mean is that it has a good amount of power to it and that it has a big sweet spot. A powerful racket is gonna help you get the ball over the net, and a big sweet spot means that you don't have to make perfect contact every time. Power rackets with a big sweet spot tend to be rackets with a 100 to 104 square inch head size. They also tend to be a little bit stiffer and thicker as well. That's what gives them their big power. The Babolat Pure Drive Team, the Yonex E-Zone 100L, the Head Extreme MPL, and the Wilson Ultra 100L are all perfect options here. They weigh between 280 and 285 grams, which is light and easy to swing, but also not too light to the point where you lose stability. Don't get too caught up in the details when you're picking between these. They all have similar playability, and when you're a beginner, you haven't really developed any preferences yet. So I actually say pick the one you like the look of the most. This is your one opportunity to do it. Once you get better, you do not get to pick a racket based off of looks anymore, so you might as well take advantage of it here. Now, the one thing you want to be careful of when you're a beginner is that you don't get a racket that helps you too much. I know that might sound counterintuitive, but let me explain. There's an important genre of rackets that are designed to literally make tennis too easy to the point where you don't have to do any work yourself. These are called game improvement rackets, and they usually have massive head sizes, bigger than 107 square inches, and they're also very light, usually less than 270 grams. I know these characteristics might sound good. Light means easy to swing, big head size means you'll always hit the ball, but these rackets won't push you to become better. One of the most important things you learn in the early stages of tennis is how to interpret the feedback your racket gives you. Rackets are designed to give you positive and negative feedback depending on the quality of your shot. The problem is, the bigger you go in head size, the lighter the racket is, the less feedback it gives you. So game improvement rackets might not punish you in certain instances, but they're also not going to reward you when you do something well. You need that when you're starting out, because that's how you build your technique. So as enticing as those super forgiving rackets may be, they're not right for beginners. Those rackets are generally made for slightly older people who perhaps don't have the mobility and strength that they used to, and they just want to go out and play without really looking to improve in the long run. But for most beginners, stick to those 100 to 104 square inch frames I recommended. Those will help you out just the right amount, and they'll also force you to develop so that you can eventually take your tennis to the next level. The next level is intermediates, and intermediates can generally keep a rally going by consistently getting the ball over the net, and at this point you're probably also hitting the ball a little harder and the ball's coming at you faster. This is where an important rule of thumb in tennis comes in. You always want to swing the heaviest racket you can swing. the 270 to 280 gram racket is probably too light at this point, so it's time to move into the 295 to 300 gram category. Because you're stronger, you've got better footwork, and you've developed the proper tennis muscles, you're not going to struggle to swing these, and more weight's going to give you more plow through, more stability, pretty much more of everything. Now, the other thing that happens when you become an intermediate is that you develop preferences towards certain playability characteristics. Topspin, flat shots, serve, touch, volleys. You've learned them all at this point, and there may be some things that you're better at than others. You want to use that as a starting point to dictate the racket you choose. So unlike at the beginner level when you didn't really want to get too specific about playability, now you start exploring with the various types. Boiling it down as simply as possible, there are 3 categories of rackets you should look at as an intermediate: power rackets, spin rackets, and all-around rackets. There is another category, control rackets, but those tend to be much more difficult to use. They're quite heavy, they have really small sweet spots, and as an intermediate, you're not quite at that level yet. So power rackets, spin rackets, and all-around rackets, and the most popular category here is power rackets. In fact, it's pretty likely that your beginner racket was just a lightweight power racket. The Ultra, Pure Drive, and E-Zone all fall into that category, so if you were happy with one of those, you should consider moving on to the heavier version. Power rackets are the most user-friendly, but they also hit the hardest, so they work for most types of players, whether you're trying to consistently get the ball over the net or if you do like to go for big shots. I personally think most intermediates should go for a power racket, especially if you played with one as a beginner, because you'll feel right at home swinging it. So once again, I recommend the Pure Drive, the E-Zone, and the Ultra in their standard weight versions. Now, spin rackets have a lot of overlap with power rackets. They also tend to be stiffer, thicker, and have a 100 square inch head size, so they are quite powerful, but they also always have some sort of spin-oriented technology. They probably have a really open string pattern. Another common thing nowadays is what we call spin grommets, which allow the strings to move more and produce more spin. And also, spin rackets tend to have some sort of aerodynamic design to them. Spin rackets amplify spin onto the ball, but they also just generally complement spin technique very well. So if you realize that you naturally generate a lot of topspin, odds are a spin racket will make you feel even more confident. There are also a ton of good spin rackets. The Babolat Pure Aero 100 has been the most popular for decades now. The Head Extreme MP is another great option. And then the Yonex E-Zone 100 also pretty much doubles down as a spin racket. Now we're going to move on to the most versatile category, all-around rackets. And this is a category of rackets that has grown a lot in recent years. Well-rounded rackets perform very well at everything without being too outstanding at any one thing. The Headspeed MP really paved the way for this style of frame, and because it became so popular, a lot of other brands started making their own versions, and there's actually one that I think works better than the Speed for intermediates, the Wilson Blade 100. The Speed is great, but it does have a heavy swing weight, which makes it a bit tougher to swing. The Blade swings much lighter, so it's more forgiving, which is still really important at that level. You can't go wrong with either though, so if the all-around racket sounds like it could fit you well, those two are a great place to start. But now we're going to move on from intermediate rackets to advanced rackets, and we're going to start with aggressive baseliners. Once you're an advanced player, these sort of blanket statements I've been making, like go for a 280 gram power racket or stick to the 300 gram weight category, they don't apply quite as much. What advanced players look for in a racket are little intricacies in playability that can give them the edge, whether it's to hit harder or to make them more confident, whatever it may be. Obviously, it's not like you have to play with one racket to play a certain way, but some rackets have characteristics that match up really well to certain play styles, so that's what we're going to talk about now, and we're going to start with aggressive baseliners. Aggressive baseliners are players who spend most of their time around the baseline, but they like to dictate points, so they hit a lot of angles or powerful shots to push their opponent around, or just to hit an outright winner. Jannik Sinner is a great example of a fantastic aggressive baseliner. The key characteristics you want in your racket here are a good amount of power, also a lot of precision because you want to be confident in your racket when you go big, and also a decent amount of spin because that's how we control powerful shots nowadays. The Speed MP is a great option here because it's fairly thick at 23 millimeters and it has a big head size, which gives it good power and a ton of spin potential. The difference between the Speed and some other 100s is that it has a constant beam, which gives it a really consistent flex and more precision than something like the Extreme MP or the Clash 100. The Pure Strike 98 is another great racket for aggressive baseliners. It's a controlled 98, so it has the precision and accuracy you'd want from a smaller head-sized racket, but it's more powerful than most 98s because of its more rigid beam design and its higher swing weight. It's definitely a little bit tougher to use than the Speed, but if you're a high-level player who can handle that swing weight, you're going to love the extra power it gives you, especially if you're coming from something like the Wilson Blade. Then the VCore 98 is primarily a spin racket, but Jannik Ergonomics designed this version to have more mass in the upper hoop, which gives you more leverage for power, and it's also extremely stable. It's not as accurate as the Speed, the Strike, and the next rackets that I'll talk about, so this is more for those aggressive baseliners who hit their powerful shots with a ton of spin, rather than those players who like to flatten them out and need a really consistent response. Next, we have what I consider to be the best aggressive baseliner racket, the Babolat Pure Aero 98. It's quite a stiff 98, and it's part of the Aero family, so it has that aerodynamic design which accelerates very quickly through contact. That means you can generate a lot of racket head speed, and when you combine that with the stiff response, this racket hits a huge ball when you decide to go for a big shot. What's so unique about the Aero 98 though is just how ridiculously consistent it is. When you compare it to other modern players' rackets like the V-Core 98 I just talked about, it is a much more confidence-inducing frame. There's a reason this racket has become so popular since it first came out. Obviously, Alcaraz is a great endorsement for it, but it really is the cream of the crop for an attacking-minded game style, and it's probably going to show up a couple more times on this list. The last racket I want to talk about here is the Wilson RF01 line. Go for the 01 Pro if you're comfortable hitting a 320-gram racket. Go for the 01 and customize it up to 310 if you're not. These two rackets are the pinnacle of stand close to the baseline, take the ball early and on the rise, and dictate points with precision and power. They are deadly accurate frames with really small but fantastic feeling sweet spots, and this oval beam makes them much more powerful than traditional point and shoot rackets like the Pro Staff 97. The issue with both of these is their defensive capabilities. They always need to be swung fast with purposeful shots, but that's what aggressive baseliners do. And out of all the rackets I just mentioned, these are the best for finishing points off at the net. Okay, I know that was a lot of rackets for aggressive baseliners, but like I said, this is a very popular playstyle nowadays, so obviously a lot of brands are making rackets that suit it very well. Now let's move on to counterpunchers. Counterpunchers are players who spend pretty much all their time at the baseline, and their main goal is to stay in a rally, put every ball back in, and eventually force a mistake out of their opponent. Andy Murray and Daniil Medvedev are a couple of all-time great counterpunchers. Djokovic too a little bit, especially at the beginning of his career. The most important thing to look for in a racket here is consistency. You never want to miss, so you don't want your racket to surprise you, and the most consistent rackets are control rackets. Even though other types of rackets have become more popular recently, there are still a ton of good control rackets. The Wilson Blade 98 1820 has been around for decades, and it's still one of the most popular for this style of play. It has a fairly small 98 score inch head size and a dense string bed, which makes it very accurate, and it also has a thin beam and a soft flex, which increases dwell time. Counterpunchers love a long dwell time because it gives them a split second more to feel the ball in the string bed and control where they're going to put it, and it also soaks up some power, so it means you're very rarely going to overhit a shot. That's really the key with counterpunching. You don't really want anything extra from the racket. No extra power, no extra spin. You just want the deadest, flattest response from your frame. The Onyx Percept 97 and the Technofiber TF40 are two pretty similar options that also have a soft, thin beam and a super consistent flex. Neither of them have an 18x20 string pattern, at least not the versions that we carry, but their string beds are quite dense for 1619, so they're still plenty consistent. Of course, the Blade 98 1619 is another good option, but it does have a more open pattern than those two, so just keep that in mind. And finally, you've got the Gravity Pro. I'm sure a lot of you knew this was coming at some point, and for me, this is by far the best racket for counterpunchers right now. The Gravity Pro has a really thin 20mm beam, which gives it a buttery smooth flex. It has some of the best feel you can find right now, and it also has an 18x20 string pattern, so it ticks all the boxes for consistency. What separates this from most other control rackets for me is its 100 square inch teardrop head shape, which gives it much more power and spin than you would expect from its specs. I know I said you're not really looking for that here, but with the Gravity Pro, it doesn't come at the expense of any control whatsoever. That's usually the problem with rackets that amplify power and spin. It takes away from consistency and control. That's the magic behind the Gravity, and that's why, to me at least, it feels like the perfect modern take on a consistent counterpunching frame. The game has evolved to a point where a racket that lacks any sort of power and spin could get pushed around when rallies start to go faster. The only thing to note here is that it has a high swing weight and it's pretty sluggish, so it's definitely not easy to use, but if you can swing it and you play a counterpunching game style, I think you have to give it a demo. Now we're going to move on to grindy spin players, and these are sort of like modern day counterpunchers, but instead of using traditional flat control to never miss, they use big spin. Nadal is pretty much the perfect example of the ultimate spin grinder. Obviously, he also had some incredible offensive potential, but whenever he needed to get into his shell and never miss, that's the playstyle he defaulted to, especially against Federer. Now these players could hit spin with any racket, but the more spin the better here, because more spin equals more control, and more spin also means the ball is going to pop up more, which makes it harder for their opponent to attack. So kind of like how we were looking for the most controlled racket in the last section, here we want the racket to be as spin friendly as possible. The most spin friendly rackets are spin oriented 100 square inch frames. These rackets became incredibly popular during the mid 2000s when Nadal popularized this style, so there are a ton to choose from. Obviously, the Pure Aero 100 is kind of the OG spin monster. Thick beam, forgiving head size, 16 by 19 string pattern, spin technology, and then, of course, it has this very aerodynamic design. This beam design complements that windshield wiper technique better than pretty much anything else out there. So if I had to name one racket that I think would work best for most players wanting to play this way, it's still the Aero 100. The V-Core 100 is Yonex' take on a big spin racket, but it is pretty different from the Aero. Like I said with the V-Core 98, Yonex reshaped this version to have more mass in the upper hoop, which does give it a lot more power. Because of that, it's not quite as consistent as the Aero 100, but if you do hit with enough spin to control that launch to your side, it's a great option because it is better for offensive shots. The Head Extreme MP is also a fantastic option. It's not got quite the historical success of the Aero, but if you compare this version of the Extreme and the Aero, the Extreme actually does have a slightly more open string pattern, which makes it a bit more inherently spin friendly. Now, while I do think most big spin players should go for 100 square inch spin rackets, there is one 98 that I think works very well too, the Extreme Pro. I've often compared this racket to the Aero 98 and the V-Core 98, but for me, this is the one that works best if you just want to sit back there and hit with big spin. The V-Core and the Aero both have more power, but also a slightly less spinny feel. This has that plush sensation of the ball going deep into the strings with lots of snapback that you associate more with 100s. The difference compared to 100s, of course, is that this is much more accurate. So if you do want to vary up your shot selection from time to time, the Extreme Pro is one of the best options for grindy spin players. So the all-court game is one of the most difficult styles to play well, but it's also very rewarding if you're good at it. It's hard because you have to be good at pretty much everything on a tennis court, but it's also hard to play against because your opponent is always on their toes since they never really know what's coming. A lot of the best players in history are elite all-courters, and Roger Federer is one of the first that comes to mind. He could overpower anyone from the baseline, but could also defend incredibly well. Of course, he had a nearly perfect serve, some of the best touch we've ever seen, and fantastic volleys. Djokovic has worked really hard to become a better all-courter. Even though it's not his natural game style, he knew that it would make him a better player in the long run, and it's clearly worked out very well for him. And then obviously there's Carlos Alcaraz, who might be the most naturally gifted all-courter that I've ever seen. His ability to go from hitting powerful ground strokes on one point to then hitting the deftest touch shot in the next has been pretty much impossible for all his opponents to deal with, even Sinner. Now, it's pretty easy to describe what makes a good all-court racket. It's a racket that makes you feel comfortable hitting any type of shot with, so it's time to talk about the Aero 98 again. I've already said it's almost perfect for aggressive baseline play, but it's also very good for touch shots. It doesn't necessarily have the best feel, but it has this really balanced maneuverability that makes it easy to switch up your shot selection and move it quickly when you're at the net. It's also ridiculously stable for how light it is, and like I've already said, it's quite precise, which just adds to its performance on volleys. Its defensive capabilities are also fantastic. It's not as consistent as a control racket, and it's not as spin friendly as the true spin monsters, but it has a bit of both, especially that spin. So if you need to go into a defensive shell, you definitely can. Then there's the E-Zone 98, which is similar in its variety. It's not quite as good for offensive shots, but it's softer and has more easy spin than the Aero, so what it lacks in offense, it makes up for on defense. The throat is also super thin, which makes it very maneuverable, so again, great for varying up your shot selection and for reacting quickly up at the net. And then the last racket I'm going to talk about here is the Technofiber T-Fight 305S. This might look like a control racket at first glance. It has a constant beam, a pretty dense string pattern, but there are a few design characteristics here that give it incredible variety. Unlike most constant beamed rackets, this has a combination of an oval design in the throat with a half moon shape in the hoop. The oval part of the beam is quite rigid, which gives it good power, and then the half moon hoop softens it up for control. That means you can attack and defend with this racket, and it responds well for either type of shot, and then it also has some of the best feel of any frame right now. It's foam filled, which gives it this really clean pop, so you have a great connection to the ball, which is awesome for touch shots. And foam also helps to stabilize a racket, so it's rock solid for volleys. My one criticism of this racket in the past was its maneuverability. It always felt a bit sluggish, so it wasn't the best all quarter. Maneuverability is just so important for that. But that's what they worked on with this version. They lowered the swing weight, making it so much quicker and whippier to the point where now, I wouldn't say it's its strong suit, but it's certainly not an issue anymore. Now, before we move on to the next playstyle, I do want to talk about a racket that I'm not going to recommend to all court players, even though it might seem like one of the most obvious choices. It's the Head Speed MP. The Speed MP is very well-rounded, but more for well-rounded playability around the baseline. It's spin-friendly, it's powerful, it's consistent, so it's great for hitting any type of ground stroke, but it's actually a pretty slow racket. Like I said, maneuverability is so important to be good all around the court, so I just don't think it's quite fast enough to be in the top 3 or 4 rackets I'd recommend for this style of play. I know that's a little bit bizarre considering what I've said in the past, but hopefully that makes sense. It's still a fantastic racket, and if they do decide to lower the swing weight on the next version, it could become much better for all quarters. So the last 2 play styles are players that play with a one-handed backhand and serve and volleyers. I will separate the two, but there's going to be a lot of overlap. That's because for both these play styles, you want a racket that's stable, head light and maneuverable, and also something that can redirect pace efficiently. One of the best rackets to play with if you're a one-hander is the Pro Staff 97. There's a reason it's been so popular for one-handers for so long. It ticks all the boxes. It has a head-light balance, and it also has a small head size, which gives it that whippy feel, and although it does have quite a thin beam, it's a stiffer thin-beamed racket, so it's more powerful and also extremely stable. The same goes for the Percept 97H. It has the same head size, it's also very head-light, and it's really heavy at 330 grams, so it's rock solid when you're flowing through that one-handed motion. That's really important for a one-hander. It can be a real weapon, but you have to let the racket do a lot of the work. You can't muscle through the stroke in the same way you can a forehand or even a two-handed backhand these days. That's why you need a super solid racket. And finally, the RF01 Pro is one of the best rackets for a one-hander right now, especially those one-handers who like to take the ball really early and play with a lot of redirection. It's extremely precise and noticeably faster than the Percept and the Pro Staff because of that oval beam I talked about earlier. So if you can add your own racket head speed, it will respond very well, and of course, it's also very stable. Now, if you do play with a spinny one-handed backhand, for one, you're a wizard. I obviously don't have a one-hander, but I tried it when I made that video last year, and it was almost impossible to add spin to my shots. But if you are able to do that, the VCore 95 is pretty much perfect. Again, since it's a 95, it's super maneuverable and whippy, and it's much more spin friendly than any 95 I've ever tested because of all the spin tech they put in the VCore line. I don't think it's quite solid enough in stock form. For some reason, Yonex gave it a really low swing weight, but if you add lead to the hoop and throw on a leather grip, you'll be fine. Now we're gonna move on to the serve and volley play style, and to be honest, it's pretty much all the same rackets. So for serve and volleying, you want something that helps you add a bit of power to your first serve, something that's easy to kick the ball with, and then something that's solid, precise, and quick up at the net. That applies to all the rackets I just talked about. They're also all 1619s, other than the VCore, it's a 1620, but it's the most spin-friendly of the bunch, so they're all pretty easy to hit a kick serve with. Then again, they're all super solid for thin-beamed rackets, so they're plenty powerful on first serves. Because they all have small head sizes, they're all exceptional up at the net. The VCore 95 would be the least at home up there because it's a bit more muted and less traditional, but it's still totally fine. Now, if I were to pick one of these as the best, I would go for the RF01 Pro, just because it has the most offensive potential in general, not just as a serve and volley stick. The nature of a serve and volleyer is to end points quickly, and this is by far the most powerful racket from the baseline compared to the other 3. Like I said in the aggressive baseline section, that's pretty much exactly what this line was designed to do. Now we're done with the play styles, but there is one racket I didn't mention for any specific play style other than the beginners and intermediates, and that's the Babolat Pure Drive. The Pure Drive is so interesting to me because I genuinely believe it can work for almost every play style in tennis other than maybe counterpunching, but it's also never going to be as standout as some others for specific ones. It's great for aggressive baseliners, but not as precise as some of the others that I mentioned. It's got a lot of spin potential, but not as much as big spin 100s. It's great for serving, it's solid up at the net, but it's not a scalpel like those point and shoot control rackets that I mentioned. I think if I were to pick one playstyle it's best for, it would be the all-court game, but again, there are just some other rackets I would recommend first. That being said, it's one of my favorite rackets, and it's probably the only frame I would would recommend for any playstyle. So at least now I've talked about it. I would have felt really bad not mentioning the pure drive today. But anyways, that is going to be the end of this video. I know it was a really long one, but hopefully you enjoyed it. I had a ton of fun making it. And if you have any questions or think I missed something, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. And remember that if you want to demo any of the rackets I talked about here today, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.